Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
When I was a child, I had a friend named Lucy. She was a neighborhood girl who would come over to my grandmother's house, which was where I lived at the time. There was a park by my house that had a deep creek next to it. I couldn't swim, so we always had to have an adult with us when we were near the creek. Lucy was a toxic friend, but I didn't know at the time. She would always threaten to stop being friends with me or stop talking to me if I didn't do what she wanted. She would always say that she deserved my toys and my family and friends more than I did. I didn't mind this, as I had a hard time making friends, and Lucy was one of my only friends. One night, Lucy came over and she said she was bored and wanted to go to the park. I told her my family was in the backyard and we had to have an adult with us to go, but she said she would leave and never come back if I didn't go to the park with her. I followed her and we went to the park. She walked right past the playground equipment to the creek, and I asked her what she was doing. She said she wanted to swim, and I told her I couldn't swim, and she called me a string of hurtful names including weak, stupid, and an awful friend. This really hurt my 5-year-old self, so I started crying. This made her even angrier, and she told me something I'll never forget. "You're an awful child. Your family deserved me and not you." I was so confused and sad that I just ran home. I never saw her again, and I just thought she was so angry she really never spoke to me again. Now, about a year ago, my family was talking about my many imaginary friends, and my mom said my friend Lucy really creeped her out because she was supposed to have a daughter before me who they wanted to name Lucy. My mother had a miscarriage, and Lucy was never born. I was stationed in Nebraska in the late 80s. At the time, I hung out with my roommate and another friend. My name is Tracy. My roommate's name was also Tracy. And our third friend's name was Stacy. When we were together, everyone always thought we were lying, and being the silly teenagers we were, we always found it funny. One weekend, we decided to take a road trip to Kansas City, Missouri. We were speeding down the highway, laughing and singing at the top of our lungs. We were happy and having the time of our lives. Stacy was driving, and she had a bit of a lead foot. She must have been going too fast, because before long a state trooper pulled up behind us and turned on his lights. Stacy immediately pulled over. By the time the officer made it to her window, she already had her license and registration in hand and the window down. The officer looked at her, and then looked at me and Tracy. He then said, "I want you to follow me. Don't try to run off or y'all be going to jail." He then turned, walked back to his car, and got into it. Needless to say, the three of us were puzzled, and spoke amongst ourselves to wonder why he didn't simply take Stacy's ID and write her a ticket. The officer pulled out slowly, and we dropped in behind him and followed him down the road. He drove a few miles, then exited the highway. He drove a little ways and turned onto a dirt road that was surrounded by tall stalks of corn. We all stopped speaking as we became more alarmed. However, we were young and scared, and since he was a police officer, we continued to follow him. The officer drove for some time down this dirt road and then pulled into an area that had a big beat-up old barn. As he parked and we stopped behind him, a group of men with shotguns exited the barn. It wasn't until that point did we realize we were in mortal danger and panic set in. The officer walked back to our car and told Stacy to get out and follow him to his car. As she got outside, she looked at me and Tracy with sheer terror on her face. She followed him to his car and he motioned for her to get into the passenger side. She did. Tracy and I were crying as the armed men stood outside of the car looking at us. We prayed that Stacy wasn't being hurt and somehow that they would let us leave. After some time, Stacy bolted out of the officer's car and ran back to our car and jumped into the driver's seat. She was crying hysterically, so of course, Tracy and I began to cry harder. The officer approached our car, this time going to Tracy's window in the front passenger seat. He asked, "Is it true y'all are in the Air Force?" To which Tracy replied, "Yes, sir." The officer calmly said, "Get out of here and go back to where y'all came from. I better not see y'all again." Stacy turned on the car, whipped it around, and sped back down the dirt road. She somehow navigated back to the highway. As we drove back toward the base, the silence was only broken by an occasional sob from one of us. Stacy drove for a while, and as soon as we crossed back over into Nebraska, she pulled over on the side of the highway and began to sob heavily. Tracy and I hugged her and asked if she was hurt in any way. She shook her head no. She wasn't hurt. After she calmed down enough, she told us what happened in the police car. After she got into the vehicle, she offered the police officer her ID and told him she was sorry for speeding. He took her information and then asked her, "What are you doing with those two?" Stacy was white. She explained that we were on a road trip. He then told her that if she would do certain favors for him, he might let us go with a warning. At that, Stacy had a complete meltdown. I guess while he was waiting for her to calm down, he finally looked at her ID and saw that she had given him a military ID. He asked her if we were all in the military, and between sobs, she said we were. He asked where we were stationed, and she told him, and he said to go back to her car. After Stacy told us what had occurred, I think it hit all three of us at the same time that the only thing that saved us was that we were in the military and stationed at a nearby base. We hugged each other and cried until we could not cry anymore. We didn't report what had happened. Again, we were teenagers and didn't think we would be believed over a law enforcement officer, and we never talked about it after that day. That incident has haunted me for years, all of the what-ifs. But as I have gotten older, what haunts me most is the thought that others may not have been as lucky as we were. I live in Chicago with my best friend and roommate, Sarah. We're both 24, work typical 9-to-5 jobs, and love a good party as much as the next person. But what happened to us last Halloween was something straight out of a horror movie. It's been almost a year, and I still get chills thinking about it. A few days before Halloween, this strange box showed up at our door. No label, no return address, just a sleek black box with gold accents. It was heavy and felt expensive, for lack of a better word. At first, we thought it was for one of our neighbors, this super fancy couple that lives a few doors down. But the box didn't have any names or unit numbers. It only had our address. We took it inside because, honestly, we were curious. Inside, there was this gorgeous embossed invitation to a Halloween ball. I'm talking next-level fancy. Thick, ivory paper, gold leaf details, and calligraphy that looked like it was handwritten. It invited us to a night of mystery at some mansion on the outskirts of the city. And tucked underneath the invite were these masks, ornate, Venetian-style, full-face masks that looked way too expensive to be part of some regular Halloween thing. Sarah was all in from the moment she saw the masks. She kept saying it was a sign that we should go. Like, how often would we get the chance to attend something like that? I was hesitant. I mean, we didn't even know who sent this. And it didn't feel like it was meant for us. But Sarah convinced me. "Come on, we'll never get to go to something this fancy again," she said. "What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words, right? So we put on our best dresses and the masks that came with the invite. I had to admit, we looked pretty badass. The location was this massive old mansion way out past the city, and when we arrived, there were tons of people already there. Everyone was dressed to the nines, fancy gowns, tuxes, and masks just as elaborate as ours. But from the moment we walked in, something felt off. No one was really talking. It wasn't like your usual party where people are laughing and mingling. Most people were standing around in small groups, whispering or just staring at each other. It was dead quiet, aside from the soft classical music playing in the background. At first, I thought maybe we were just early or something. But as time went on, the vibe only got weirder. People would glance at us but wouldn't engage, like they were waiting for something. I tried to brush it off, but the uneasiness kept building. After about an hour, I turned to Sarah and whispered, "I think we should go." She nodded, looking more uncomfortable by the minute. We decided to quietly make our exit, but when we got to the front doors, they wouldn't open. I thought maybe we were missing something, like maybe there was a latch or something keeping the door closed, but no. It was like the doors were locked from the outside. We looked around thinking there must be another exit, but everywhere we turned, people were standing in groups, just staring at us. Panic started creeping in. We moved to the back of the room, trying to blend in and figure out what the hell was happening. Then it got worse. One by one, the guests started raising their right hands. Slowly, almost in sync, like they were following some invisible cue. On their fingers, each person wore the same ring, thick, gold, with some sort of dark stone in the middle. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight, and whispered, "We need to leave now." We pushed our way through the crowd, trying to stay calm, but it felt like every pair of eyes was on us. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and Sarah was breathing fast beside me. We tried another door, a side entrance near the kitchen, but it was locked too. The windows were no better. Each one bolted shut or sealed somehow. At this point, we didn't care about being subtle. We started running. We darted down a hallway, hoping to find another way out. Every corner we turned seemed to lead us deeper into the house, and behind us we could hear footsteps, not running, but following, calmly, slowly, like they knew we had nowhere to go. Finally, by some miracle, we found a small side door near the back of the house that opened. We practically fell out into the cold night air, sprinting toward the street. There was a row of parked cars, but neither of us had driven. In our panic, we didn't think to call a ride until we were half a block away. We tore off our masks and costumes in the middle of the street, throwing them into some random bushes, and hailed the first cab we saw. When we got home, we locked every single door and window. I was shaking so hard I could barely text. But here's the part that freaks me out the most. When we walked into the kitchen, there was something on the table that wasn't there when we left. It was a pair of masks. The two masks we had just torn off and left outside of the party. And they were left inside our locked apartment. We don't know how they got there or who left them, or how they were able to get there so quickly and leave again. I tried telling myself it had all been some elaborate prank, or Sarah was just messing with me, but I could tell that she really was as freaked out as I was. We agreed to throw out the masks and not tell anybody about the party. Sometimes I still think about what would have happened if we hadn't found that side door. Today was my first time voting in a big city. I moved here last month, and while there's been a lot to adjust to, I'd been looking forward to casting my vote. There's an energy about a place like this, an unspoken pulse running through the streets, and I thought I'd finally get to be a part of it. I'd planned every detail, the bus schedule, the route to the polling station, even where to grab a coffee afterwards. The street was strangely empty, even for the early hour. The usual hum of the city was dampened. I stood waiting for the bus for what felt like ages, when I heard an engine rumbling down the street. It was a van, an old gray utility van, the kind with windows covered in paint-splattered panels and dents along the side, slowed to a stop right in front of me. There was a sign taped to the passenger door, "Free shuttle to polls." The driver leaned out the window, fixing his gaze on me. His face was eager. He smiled, but his eyes were blank, expressionless. Something inside me told to stay put and just keep waiting for the bus. But I could feel him staring at me, waiting for me to climb in. And it took everything in me to force a polite but firm shake of my head no. For a moment, he just sat there, the engine idling. I couldn't look away. Finally, he gave a slight nod, his mouth stretching into a thin, tight smile, and he drove off down the street. As he disappeared around the corner, I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. As I stood there, I began to wonder if I had just turned down an easy ride to the polls. A young guy joined me at the bus stop, rummaging through his wallet as he walked up. He looked up and we made eye contact, and I saw he was holding a voter registration card. I felt a small bit of comfort from the presence of another person. A few minutes passed and the low rumble of that engine returned. The same gray van rounded the corner and pulled up once more. The sign was still hanging in the window, flapping slightly in the breeze, and the driver didn't say a word. He just rolled down the window and stared at us, his eyes unblinking, looking at me first and then shifting his eyes to the guy next to me. We both just sat there at the bus stop, unsure what to do. I was hoping he'd stay and wait for the bus with me, but the young man stood up from the bench and looked at me as if he expected me to get up too and join him in getting into the van. I just shook my head no and smiled, and he waved, opened the van door and got inside. The van pulled away, the driver's eyes meeting mine one last time in the side mirror before they disappeared down the street. The minutes were dragging by. I was checking the time on my phone repeatedly, growing more anxious with every tick. When the bus finally arrived, I boarded quickly, finding a spot near the front, and kept my eyes glued to the road, wondering if we'd come upon the van on our way. But there was no sign of it as we approached the polling place. The station was lovely, full of people and volunteers moving around, the sound of conversation filling the space. After casting my vote, I glanced around, looking for the young man who'd gotten into the van. I scanned the crowd, looking for any sign of him, but he was nowhere to be found. Trying to sound casual, I approached one of the poll workers, a friendly woman with a badge and clipboard. "How often do the shuttles arrive?" I asked. She gave me a puzzled look. "Shuttles?" I mentioned seeing the free shuttle to the polls sign, and she had no idea what I was talking about. My stomach twisted as her words sank in. I muttered a quick thank you, forced a smile, and walked outside. On my way home, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, scanning the parked cars and the shadowed alleys. I hurried home and went inside and did my best to forget about what had happened earlier. But I couldn't help but wonder, who was driving that van? Where did they go? And what happened to the nice young man that I met at the bus stop? It all started when I, a broke college student looking for some extra cash, agreed to house sit over spring break. Seemed like an easy gig, just chill in a fancy mansion for a week, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. So this distant relative I barely knew existed hits me up out of the blue with an offer I couldn't refuse. They needed someone to watch over their empty mansion, the Blackwood Manor, deep in the woods. The email was vague, bordering on cryptic, but promised a fat paycheck in return. Naturally, my broke self jumped at the opportunity. As I rolled up to Blackwood Manor, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my gut. The place looked straight out of a horror movie, a creepy old mansion surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. The driveway stretched on forever, and the closer I got, the more the mansion seemed to loom over me, like it was watching my every move. I pushed open the creaky iron gates and stepped into the courtyard, feeling like I'd just walked into a haunted house at a theme park. The whole place was eerily quiet, with not even the wind daring to rustle the leaves. I hesitated a moment, wondering if it was too late to bail, but the promise of cold, hard cash kept me moving forward. Inside, Blackwood Manor was straight up spooky. It was like stepping back in time to the Victorian era, with dusty old furniture covered in moth-eaten sheets and creepy-ass portraits staring at me from every wall. I tried to shake off the heebie-jeebies crawling up my spine, reminding myself it was just an old house. But damn if it didn't feel like it was alive. The first few days were pretty uneventful. I wandered around the mansion, poking my nose into rooms that hadn't seen daylight in God knows how long. But as the days dragged on, things started getting weird. I'd hear footsteps echoing in empty hallways when I knew for a fact I was alone. Doors would creak open on their own, slamming shut behind me with a force that made my heart skip a beat. And then there were the whispers, soft, barely audible voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, I brushed it off as my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. But the longer I stayed in that damn mansion, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Then came the night that changed everything. I was dead asleep when a blood-curdling scream ripped through the silence, jolting me awake so fast I nearly fell out of bed. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer as I stumbled into the hallway, following the sound to its source. The locked door at the end of a deserted corridor. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the key, unlocking the door with a click that sounded deafening in the silence. I swung the door open, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, but something compelled me forward, deeper into the bowels of the mansion. As I descended into the cellar, the air grew colder, thicker, like I was wading through a pool of ice. Cobwebs brushed against my face, and the stench of decay filled my nostrils, making me gag. And then I saw them. two glowing orbs staring back at me from the shadows. I froze, my blood turning to ice as the orbs drew closer, revealing a twisted, nightmarish figure that seemed to defy all logic and reason. It was like something straight out of my nightmares, a creature from the depths of hell itself. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. And then, with a sudden rush of movement, the creature lunged at me, its claws outstretched, ready to tear me apart. But just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the darkness. I stumbled back up the stairs, my mind reeling with terror and confusion. What the hell had I just seen? Was I losing my mind, or was there something truly evil lurking in the walls of Blackwood Manor? In the days that followed, I was plagued by nightmares, visions of unspeakable horrors that left me trembling and drenched in sweat. I tried to convince myself it was all just a trick of the mind, a product of spending too much time alone in a creepy old mansion. But deep down, I knew the truth. Blackwood Manor was haunted, and I was its latest victim. I don't know what happened to the mansion after that, and honestly, I don't want to. Some things are better left buried in the past. Blackwood Manor is one of them. But even now, years later, the memory still haunts me, reminding me that some nightmares never really end. And as I sit here, recounting my tale for whoever will listen, I can't help but wonder if Blackwood Manor is still standing, still waiting for its next victim to stumble into its dark embrace.